What's up, YouTube? It's Mike here, back with another video. If you're new to the channel, I ask you to please subscribe and ring the notification bell for notifications if you like this kind of content. And if you like the video, please like the video. I get the questions on the plywood tanks regularly, and one of the most common questions I get is cost. So I have talked about this before, but they're kind of hidden in different videos where I've randomly talked about it, or in my video where I finally finished the 1,500 gallon tank behind me. I broke down all the costs on what this tank cost me to make, and even on what the 1,100 gallon cost me to make. But again, it's kind of hidden at the end of the video, so this video I wanted to do dedicated to just the costs associated with building a plywood aquarium. Now, I'm not going to make you wait until the very end of the video for me to tell you exactly how much this cost me to make. I'm not going to do that to you. However, I do want to go into a bunch of specifics, because every tank built by an individual is going to cost you a different amount, and there's just so many reasons for that. So whatever it costs me is not necessarily going to be what it costs you. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that. There's a bunch of different ways to, first of all, build the tank itself. But for me personally, I deliberately found ways to save money, especially after building the 1,100. I found ways to save money on building the 1,500. So there are just certain costs that are going to differ depending on where you're located and the type of tank you build, and of course, the size. Size does matter.
Stop the cap. Stop the cap right now! Stop the cap!
So, right away, I told you I'm not going to make you wait and listen to the whole video to get a cost. This tank, 1,100 gallons, it's 10 foot long, it's 6 foot wide front to back, and it is 43 inches tall, so a little under 4 foot tall. This tank cost me about $2,000 to make. Now, I'm in the US, so USD. So about $2,000. And one of the biggest costs for this tank was the glass. So this piece of glass cost me about $800 to have custom cut. Now, locally, there is a lot of different glass places to me. However, they all source their glass relatively from the same location. It's my understanding that there's basically just a couple of actual glass companies that will do cutting and can get you whatever thickness you want, and they supply other glass companies locally. So for this piece, I happen to have a local guy who goes to my gym, who I've talked to a bunch of times. He's a buddy of mine now, who owns his own glass company. And what he mainly does is auto glass. I happened to ask him in passing one day if he can get custom sized glass. I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted 3/4 inch thick glass. So he was able to order that for me. Now, this was a couple years ago. It's been almost 2 years now, and I know prices have changed. But long story short, he custom ordered me the piece of glass for about $800. That was a huge expense. I had hoped going into this tank that I could find a used piece of glass, but at the time I was unable to find any used glass on Facebook or Craigslist or anything like that. So one of the biggest costs to this tank was the glass itself. The piece of glass is 84 inches long. It's 37 inches tall or wide, and it's 3/4 or 19 millimeter thick. The second most expensive thing about building this tank was the epoxy itself. I had never built a tank at the time, and the epoxy that I decided to go with is a rubberized coating made by Hertco, and it's very, very expensive. So I spent about $700, somewhere around there, on just epoxy, and I did, I think, 8 coats or 9 coats or something. I did a lot of coats of it, so I think it was 6 or 7 gallons that I ended up ordering. Very expensive stuff, and there's also a primer you have to get with it. So those were the two most expensive parts of it. The rest of it was simply paint and plywood and 2x4s. So the wood, the framing, and even some of the exterior trim work and stuff I did is very little money, but the expenses were the glass and the epoxy for this tank, so keep that in mind. And now when I include this cost, the total cost of about $2,000 for this tank, I'm not including the sump. I had this tank already that I ended up using as a sump. I turned it into a sump, and then I had a few other things like this cross beam. I sourced that on Craigslist. I got a good deal on it, but I had to source it. And then all the plumbing, I'm not counting that in my price. So about $2,000 to make just the tank itself. And again, the glass was expensive and the epoxy was expensive. But more recently, I have built this 1,500 gallon flatback hex tank. 3 pieces of glass now, a little bit more complicated. 2x6s used, and I also fiberglassed the entire inside of the tank. Now, when I first planned on building this tank, I didn't plan on having 3 viewing windows. I planned on having 1 viewing window to start. And also, I was not sure exactly how tall I would have to go, so I wasn't sure what kind of framing I would have to do, and I wasn't sure if I was going to fiberglass the entire tank. But anyway, I did want to make this tank bigger than the 1100, and I wanted to do it in a more cost-efficient way. However, I was not able to do that. This tank ended up costing me more, and we'll get into why. For starters, the usual expense I was worried about is the glass. Now, before I even started building this tank, this front piece of glass I found on Craigslist. And I found it was actually in Maine, which was about a 3-hour drive from me. So it's originally a tabletop. It is also 3/4 inch thick or 19 millimeter thick. And its length is 8 foot long, so 96 inches long. It's 44 inches tall or wide, and again, 19 millimeters thick. So I found that piece, and I got it for $80. $80 on Craigslist. I had to drive 3 hours to get it, but totally worth it. So I'm like, okay, great. Huge savings. I should be able to save more money. Well, during the design process, I realized that I kind of needed chamfered corners. 1, to make this access a lot better, and 2, I needed to chamfer this corner or I would never be able to access this area, which has a window, my sump, I drain to that. I need to be able to access over there. So I knew I needed to chamfer this corner. So I decided on the flatback hex tank. About a week or so later, I was able to find this piece of glass. This piece of glass is 45 inches by 45 inches by 3/4 inch thick. I found this also in the state of Maine, so I had to drive back to Maine, and I got this piece for $160. So this one actually cost me double what this cost. But the guy selling this knew how much 3/4 inch thick glass was worth, and he cared a little bit more about getting some money for it. This guy knew what it was worth, he just didn't care. He just wanted it gone. So long story short, I spent double on this smaller window, but it was still a great deal because that's only about 1/4 of what it would cost, maybe even just 1/5 of what that would cost to have custom cut. So now I had 2 windows, and originally I planned to just do a window here and then the front window, and then that side would be blocked off. I would just make that plywood. I didn't need that window really. However, about 2 months later, again, I still had not started the build process. This piece went on, this was on Facebook Marketplace. And it's another tabletop. It's 48 inches by 48 inches by 3/4, and it was $65 on Facebook Marketplace. So I had to grab it. I'm like, wow, I've got 3 pieces of glass now. They're all different sizes, but I can make a tank out of it. So I saved a lot of money by sourcing the glass and waiting it out. Took me a couple months to get it all, but I got 3 pieces of glass for not even half of what this 1 piece of glass cost me. The problem is these are very tall pieces of glass, or this one's 4 foot tall. So that made the tank get very, very tall. And once you start getting taller, there's a lot of complications, which I won't go into the pressure or how I'm able to get away with only using 3/4 inch thick glass. But it made the tank tall, so I decided that 2x6s were necessary to use to build the tank. So that cost me a lot of money. The 2x6 is very expensive. I also built this in the middle of a pandemic, so the prices of everything were going up. So the lumber and the plywood were a lot more expensive for this build, and the other most expensive part of this build was fiberglassing. So on the 1100, all I did was lay fiberglass strips into the epoxy on the seams. So very cheap, probably cost me like 20 bucks. I didn't actually fiberglass this tank. This tank, I wanted to fiberglass the entire thing with fiberglass resin and complete sheets of fiberglass. That cost me about $700 to completely fiberglass the inside of this tank. So that was a big expense. Basically, that added a lot over what this tank cost me to build. And the epoxy for this one, I used a different epoxy. I used Interseal 670HS, which is a bridge coating. They use it for like bridge and industrial type coatings like that. It was a lot cheaper. It was only $60 a gallon. I think I spent about maybe $400 or $500 on epoxy for this tank. So I saved on epoxy, I saved on glass, but it was more expensive to do the framing, more expensive to build the tank itself. So this tank cost me around $2,500. So about $500 more to build this tank. So go over it one more time. The 1100 gallon cost me about $2,000 to make, start to finish, not including filtration. The 1500 gallon cost me around $2,500 to make, not including filtration. I hope that answers most people's questions about how much it costs to build a plywood aquarium. At least that's how much it costs me. I can't stress enough that this is going to vary, and you know, people ask me for blueprints and things like that for these tanks. It's just, I did not make any blueprints. I did some sketches to help me get an idea of shape and maybe what I would need for materials and whatnot, but I really did not do any kind of blueprints or anything like that that I could supply to anybody to help them. These are DIY projects. These are things you really just have to dive in. Everybody's tank shape is going to be different depending on where you're putting it, how much room you have. I thought this tank would be the be-all and end-all, and I fit it into this spot here, and I have a lolly column over there and a wall over here, so that's why it's 10 foot long. Also, it's 6 foot wide because that fit in this corner really nice. I can come down the walkout and it works really well there. I had to break this down by size according to what fit the room best. I would have loved to have gone wider, I would have loved to have gone bigger, but this fit the room best, so I was able to get the most out of the space. It's 16 foot long at its longest point. It's 5 foot wide at its widest point. Actually, it's a little over 16 feet long. And it is 53 inches tall, so it's a little over 4 foot tall. About 4.5 foot tall. So I've encouraged people in the past, if you want a big aquarium, I really, really recommend doing a plywood build. One, you're going to learn a lot. I've never been a carpenter. That's not what I do for work. But I've learned a lot with woodworking and with a lot of different things. I learned how to do some fiberglassing, even though I'm still not good at it and I never want to do it again. I learned how to do it. So you're going to learn a lot. It's something you can go slow. You don't have to rush. It's not a $2,000 expense all at once. This is something that you can break down over the course of a few months, or if you want to go really slow, you can take a year to build it. So, you know, you can buy a little bit here and there. When I started building this tank, all I did was just buy enough to build the back wall to start. So the first day that I worked on it, I spent maybe 150 bucks, something like that, and just framed the back wall. So I got started. And that's what I encourage you guys to do. If you want to build one, or if you want to do any DIY projects, fish related, just start. Go buy a little bit. If you can't afford to buy it all, everything for the project. Just go buy some of it. It'll get you going, and you will not regret it. And then the tank that you get after is like nothing else. Not only are you going to be able to appreciate your own work, but you're going to have a very impressive, very large aquarium. You're going to be able to keep almost any fish that you've ever wanted, minus a few of them really big things. So I really hope that this helps you guys. I really hope that it answers a lot of you guys' questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to refer people to this video when people ask me, you know, how much did that cost? Because I get the question daily, literally, how much did your aquarium cost to build, or how much did those plywood tanks cost to build? So I hope this answers you guys' question. That is it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, I ask you to please comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see you in that next video.